Well, thank you for that very kind introduction and the invitation to speak here today, even if it has to be by video and from quite a distance. The topic I have been asked to address is the Rome Reborn project and how this and similar projects of large-scale urban reconstruction using digital technology can lead to exciting new research, insights, and discoveries. So to begin at the beginning with an obvious question, what exactly is Rome Reborn? The short answer is that it's an international initiative launched way back in 1996 to create a detailed 3D reconstruction of ancient Rome as it appeared in the year 320 of our era, which I will also refer to as 320 CE. This year, 320, was chosen because it was just before the capital of the Roman Empire was moved eastwards to Constantinople. It marks the peak of the imperial city's urban development. Shortly after 320, once the capital had been moved away from Rome, the emperor forbade the urban authorities from spending public money on large new building projects. Meanwhile, with the rise of Christianity first to legal status and then to be the official state religion, all happening in the 4th century CE, the city of Rome was gradually transformed with the addition of impressive new Christian basilicas. So, for those who like to divide history into neat periods, the year 320 CE is situated on the somewhat blurred boundary between the classical period and the Middle Ages. And before I get too deep into my topic, let me pause to note that the Rome Reborn project was collaborative. I obviously couldn't do it all by myself, and so I want to thank the many people who contributed in one way or another to the project, and you see their names in the slide on the screen now. Well, since 1996, the Rome Reborn project has undergone 4 major updates. The first version was completed in 2007. The latest version, Rome Reborn 4.0, came out in November of 2023. It's now available to scholars and the general public through an educational technology publishing company that I founded a few years ago called Flyover Zone. Our Chief Technology Officer, Jeremiah Stevens, is there in the room with you today representing the company, and after my talk, he will offer you a demonstration of Rome Reborn on some virtual reality headsets. And let me thank him for making the long and arduous trip to Beijing to be there with you in my place today. Thank you very much, Jeremiah. Well, the Rome Reborn model has the potential to enhance education from the earliest levels of kindergarten and elementary school on up to the university, making it possible even for young newcomers to the subject of Roman topography, which is the study of places and monuments, to quickly visualize the features of the city in their ancient context. However, the main purpose of my talk today is not to explore these educational uses of the model, but rather to highlight its scientific applications as a tool for making new research discoveries. My starting point is the idea that a reconstruction of a complex city like ancient Rome, which had approximately 7,000 buildings covering 14 square kilometers within the late antique walls, is a perfect example of a saying of Aristotle's in the Metaphysics, usually paraphrased as, "The whole is greater than the sum of the parts." Until now, scholars of Roman topography have usually focused on an individual building or monument, or on all of the monuments built by a certain family dynasty. That is, they have concentrated on the parts and have applied a diachronic methodology. That is, they have concentrated on how that part evolved over time. Now, Thanks to the arrival of digital technology, we can approach the city in a more synchronic and dynamic and holistic way. For example, now we can study how a building or a monument relates to its entire urban context, its neighborhood. We can see how buildings with the same function were distributed around the city in similar places. We can explore how certain buildings, especially the temples, were aligned with astronomical features. And finally, I think most importantly, we can understand how Rome was organized organically, even if it lacked a geometrically inspired master plan. Like all new scientific instruments, Rome Reborn allows us to make observations and run experiments. In the case of a historical discipline like Roman topography, such observations and experiments would have been impossible absent real-time travel, which my physicist friends tell me is not yet possible. Maybe it's coming someday, but we don't have it quite yet. And the rest of my talk will examine the validity of the claim I just made through 4 case studies examining the city at different scales and from different perspectives. Before presenting the studies, I think it will be helpful to give you my methodological background. Of course, in the interest of time, I'll have to be brief, but I do think that this is a good preface for you to understand what is to follow. Since its appearance in 1969, Rudolf Arnheim's important study, Visual Thinking, is a book I have greatly admired. I see much of the research I've done in my 45-year academic career as inspired by the book's aim to, quote, reestablish the unity of perception and thought. A fundamental idea in Arnheim's approach is the realization that, to paraphrase him, direct observation, far from being just a collector of random items, is an exploration by a mind that actively seeks and imposes form. In other words, visual perception isn't a passive process. It's involved at every step with cognition, which interprets sensory input and gives it form and meaning. Since Arnheim wrote, the field of visualization has become a full-fledged science, and a good starting point for understanding the field is Colin Ware's Information Visualization, a comprehensive textbook that draws on hundreds of articles and books written about the many ways that perception and thought are interconnected. Ware begins by listing several general ways that a visualization can be used, and here are the main examples. To facilitate comprehension of huge amounts of data. To enable the perception of new, unexpected, emergent properties that were not obvious in the initial data. To facilitate the formation of hypotheses through pure observation, experimentation, or re-experiencing something that once existed but no longer does. Now, the educational use of a visualization like Rome Reborn relates nicely to Ware's first point, making it easier for people to understand a huge amount of visual information. In our case, the entire urban landscape of ancient Rome. Today, my case studies will involve research uses of visualization, especially demonstrating how it helps in perceiving emergent, unexpected properties and informing hypotheses through observation, experimentation, and re-experiencing the past. Common to all these uses is the priority of observation. Research based on observation is, of course, called empiricism, and there is evidence that we are about to enter a phase in certain pioneering fields, such as law and the philosophy of science, that has already been called the empirical turn. Now, visual observation has traditionally depended on the eye unaided by instruments such as the microscope, telescope, X-ray, or in archaeology, as you see here on the screen, a ground-penetrating radar or electrical resistivity tomography image. Another source of inspiration for my application of the ancient Rome model has been the work of the philosopher of science Paul Humphreys. In his book Extending Ourselves, Humphreys called such instruments epistemic enhancers, or tools to expand our knowledge, episteme in Greek. He builds on the obvious point that no one doubts that what the trained eye of an expert sees in the output of such enhancers yields valid empirical knowledge. So you may not see much in an X-ray of your foot, but if your radiologist tells you it's broken, you tend to believe her. Humphreys' book is relevant for my talk today because it makes a strong case for viewing a computer simulation like Rome Reborn as a valid epistemic enhancer. And in the publication you see on the screen, I coined the term sympiricism for this kind of enhancer. And that's a portmanteau word that combines the two roots, simulation and empiricism. And I'm happy to report that Humphreys, whom I know personally, likes this new coinage that I made. A final piece of background to my talk concerns virtual heritage, or VH for short. VH is a new field that typically begins by digitizing in 3D a cultural heritage object, and then it demonstrates how, through visualization techniques, we can enhance our understanding of the object. If we want to take a VH approach to the vanished city of ancient Rome in the spirit of the methodological program I've been outlining, we must first recreate it using one of Humphreys' epistemic enhancers before we can use digital means to visualize our object of study and try to see something new in it. In our case, this means creating a digital urban model. Like the city itself and its parts, it will have to incorporate the three spatial dimensions. This then brings us to another preliminary matter that can only be addressed briefly here. How did we create the Rome Reborn digital reconstruction of ancient Rome as it might have appeared in the year 320 CE? And given our approach, how accurate and reliable is it? As Humphreys stated, with computer simulations, there is a danger to a priori science. Our simulations can only yield valid results to the extent that they are based on a solid foundation of data and do not merely reflect our own preconceptions or idle fancy, our a priori thoughts. The brief history of the Rome Reborn project begins with its inception in 1996, when our scientific committee met for the first time at the American Academy in Rome. Once we began work, we quickly saw that the evidence at our disposal fell into two main categories. What we called Class 1 consisted of buildings and monuments about which we had a great deal of information, such as their name, their location, design, and function. As an example, I would mention the Colosseum. It is one of the best preserved ancient buildings in Rome today. It's been accurately surveyed, georeferenced, and its different construction phases have been established through archaeological studies. And we estimate that altogether there are about 250 Class 1 features comparable one way or another to the Colosseum. Everything else we categorize as Class 2. It consists of several thousand features of the ancient city about which we often know simply that they existed, but we don't know their exact location, design, function, or construction phases. Frustrating as this may be, it's obvious that an urban model cannot simply leave them out. Although we may be less informed about the Class 2 elements, we do have some solid information to go on, including the remarkable Severan marble plan, the name given to an enormous map of the city in the time of the Emperor Septimius Severus at the beginning of the 3rd century of our era. It doesn't just show us the streets, but also the individual buildings and even their ground plans. About 10% of this plan survives in fragments, the majority of which have been integrated in the century since the remains of the map were first found in 1562. Equally useful are the two so-called regionary catalogs dating to our period, the 4th century CE. and the two are perhaps separated by a couple of decades. These catalogs provide statistics for the distribution of all the city's monuments by type across the 14 administrative districts or regions of ancient Rome. The earlier one, dated to the period of roughly 334 to 357 CE, is called the Notitia. The later one, dating to the period of 357 to 403 CE, is called the Curiosum. And as you can see in this slide, the two catalogs agree exactly on the total number of buildings in the city. They also show that the overwhelming majority of buildings belong to the category called insulae. Attentive use of these catalogs ensures that our city model is correct, at least in quantitative and distributional terms, even when it comes to the Class II monuments. Now, the exact meaning of the term insula has been much debated, but everyone agrees that it refers to apartments, whether the individual apartment buildings or, much more likely, the individual rental units inside those buildings. So if our city model mainly contains apartment buildings distributed by region according to the statistics given by these catalogs, we cannot be too far off in conveying the look and feel of the urban landscape in our period. Moreover, if, as seems reasonable, we base our apartment buildings on the numerous well-preserved examples of the types found at Rome's nearby port of Ostia, then accuracy is even more within our grasp. This is because, as the scholar James Packer has shown, there were only 3 basic design types for the apartment buildings at Ostia, and presumably this was also true of Rome. Of course, each type had many variations in terms of length, width, and height. Some buildings had only 1 or 2 stories, others as many as 6 or 7. But whatever the variations in scale, the basic typology identified by the American scholar remains recognizable. Populating the cityscape with variants of apartment buildings conforming to Packer's typology gives us added confidence that our model of 4th century CE Rome is as quantitatively and qualitatively accurate as the surviving evidence permits. Now, our first hope had been to speed up the modeling process by creating a digital twin of Italo Gismondi's magnificent physical model of ancient Rome. This model, housed in the Museum of Roman Civilization in Rome, was made at a scale of 1 to 250. Built from the 1930s to the 1970s as a collaboration between expert model makers and Roman archaeologists, it had long been considered a faithful representation of our knowledge of the city's topography, precisely for the year that our advisors recommended that we reconstruct, 320 CE. With the help of a talented engineer named Gabriele Guidi, first at the University of Florence and later the Politecnico of Milano, and now at my own university, Indiana University in Bloomington, Indiana, we were able to capture the 3D form of the physical model with a radar scanner running nonstop for a 30-day period. We used the resulting scan for the Class II buildings and manually created about 50 of the 250 Class I monuments and buildings. And we used the same kind of software to make those Class I monuments as an architect might have used 25 years ago to design a new building. And we called the result Rome Reborn 1.0. It was finished in February of 2007. As you can see in this slide, when viewed at a 1-to-1 scale of a virtual reality display, the Class I models of version 1.0 looked quite acceptable. Hand modeling using architectural software proved to be an effective approach when we had sufficient information about the building's plans, sections, and elevations to allow our project architects to reconstruct it digitally. However, as great an achievement as Guidi's scan of this intricate physical model was, the final result of the 6,850 Class II urban components viewed in virtual reality was not satisfactory. Not surprisingly, a physical model made at the small scale of 1 to 250 and meant to be seen from a balcony 3 meters above did not hold up to a close view at a 1-to-1 scale that virtual reality provides. And in this slide, you can see an ugly part of the model in version 1.0 that gives you an example of how bad things could look. So while continuing to make more Class 1 models by hand using architectural software, we discarded all the scan data from the physical model and sought help from Pascal Müller, then a doctoral student in Switzerland. For his doctoral research, Pascal was developing the city engine, which was useful for us because it quickly generated 3D urban models through a process known as procedural city modeling. With this approach, this software populates a topographical map of a city with buildings of the right size, number, and architectural types and styles. And you've been looking in this video clip at the city engine making version 2.0 of Rome Reborn for us. And we finish with some Class 2 apartment buildings on the screen. Well, as you can see, this definitely helped us to replace all the Class 2s from the scan data of the physical model, and to do so with a great upgrade to the overall urban model. We called this version of the model Rome Reborn 2.0, and now I will play a video that will show you Rome Reborn 2.0. Now, nice as version 2.0 was, and I think you will agree looking at the video, it's pretty good, certainly much better than version 1.0, we weren't finished. The price of improving the visual quality of those thousands of Class 2 urban components was that the overall city model had too much data for the personal computers of that period to process and run in real time. And real time means generating at least 60 frames per second as the user tries to move through the scene. In fact, we couldn't even achieve 1 frame per second. This very slow frame rate was fine for generating video segments, but not for VR. So we created a lot of videos that were used in short documentaries, including by commercial television, and by ourselves, which we posted on YouTube and Vimeo, and they've been seen by over 3 million people. Well, the response from schools and the general public was very encouraging, but the original purpose of the project back in 1996 was to allow students and scholars to re-experience the city in real time, moving where they wanted to go and seeing the things that they wanted to see. Of course, a pre-rendered video cannot offer this freedom and flexibility. So it was back to the drawing board to try to find a new way to optimize version 2.0 so that consumer-level computers could generate at least those 60 frames per second needed for real-time exploration. That was our focus in the period 2011 to 18, when we rebuilt the existing components of the city model, utilizing optimization techniques pioneered for the game industry, and greatly reducing the computational demands that the model placed on a computer running Rome Reborn. And we called the result Rome Reborn 3.0. And to tell you the truth, you're looking at a screenshot of Rome Reborn 3.0. I wasn't at all satisfied with the result. For technical reasons, we had to show all those Class 2 buildings with a low level of detail, and the lighting on the model was poor. So as soon as we finished version 3.0, we started to work on the current version. Version 4.0 was released in November of 2023. Its main advance is that it corrects those shortcomings by increasing the level of detail and providing better lighting, yet all of this with no loss of optimization. And let me stop now and let you enjoy I hope you will be enjoying the fly-through of the model. Well, in the demonstration part of today's event, you will have a chance to explore the city model and see for yourself how powerful a resource it is for teaching students about the ancient city. Our company has given many demonstrations of our virtual tour, taking you on a flight over the ancient city, and from these experiences we have gathered lots of anecdotal evidence that virtual reality is the right solution, not only for teaching new students about the ancient city, but in motivating them to want to learn about it in the first place. And let me play a video clip showing the reactions of several students at the University of California, Berkeley, and at a small liberal arts college in New England called Mount Holyoke College.
What's it like, Juno?
It like really feels like I'm just hovering. It looks so real. It really does. Yeah. This is awesome. It's like every tile of the roof, every cobblestone. There's birds in the sky.
So we're at Mount Holyoke College, October 24th, 2024. And who are we talking to?
Casey McLaughlin.
Casey.
I am a freshman, class of 2028.
And do you have a major yet?
Yes, I just declared for classics.
Classics. Okay, great. And you've been to Rome. Wonderful, at least twice, I heard. And you had a chance to look at the flight over Rome in our demonstration here at Mount Holyoke. What did you think?
It was amazing. I was really, really cool. And the little hand pointing everywhere was very helpful to get me acclimated, find directions. It was awesome.
And did it make you want to come back for more?
Oh, yes. Definitely.
And maybe study Roman topography and study
yes,
the ancient city in more depth?
It was awesome.
Do you think it would be good even in lower levels, like in 6th grade or 10th grade
totally.
Ancient history?
I would have loved this in 6th grade, 10th grade, in any grade, but yes.
Any grade, okay. Well, thank you very much.
Yeah.
Well, I hope that Rome Reborn comes to the PRC thanks to Peking University for starters, and perhaps it'll spread from there to other universities. I sincerely hope so. I'm sure it will have the same positive effect on your students and will motivate them to fall in love with ancient Rome and want to study ancient Roman topography and archaeology. But the teaching application of our work is not my main topic today. So now let's move on to our 4 case studies showing the urban model's scientific applications. And the first case study operates at the relatively small scale of 2 monuments positioned close together in the northern Campus Martius section of the city. And I'm referring to the Ara Pacis, or the Altar of Peace, and the Montecitorio Obelisk. They were not only close in space, but also in time, dating to the period 13 to 9 BCE. The altar is the single best preserved artistic monument surviving from Augustan Rome, the period of Rome's first emperor, Augustus. It is decorated with reliefs, such as the one seen in this slide, that scholars have long viewed as reflecting Augustus's self-image and the core values promoted by his regime. The obelisk was brought by the emperor from Heliopolis, near modern-day Cairo in Egypt, to Rome, and this happened during the same period that the altar was being built. Augustus's motivation in investing substantial resources to transport the obelisk all the way to Rome has long interested scholars. This was not a cheap or easy project, as you can imagine. Since, as you can see in this slide, the Montecitorio Obelisk was erected only 90 meters away from the Ara Pacis and was positioned on an extension of the altar's axis of symmetry, it has long been accepted that their proximity in space and time, as well as their visual relationship, must reflect an implicit message or ideology that emerges when we consider them together. There are 2 major questions being studied by scholars of these monuments today. What was the purpose of the visual linkage between the obelisk and the Ara Pacis? And secondly, what were the exact scale and design of the Orologium Augusti, or Augustus's sundial? It is the first question which serves as my case study today because the two co-authored articles my team recently published on it made heavy use of the Rome Reborn model, as you will see. Now, this question about the purpose of the visual linkage between the obelisk and the Ara Pacis is not as easy to answer as it might seem at first glance, since both monuments have been restored and moved to very different new locations in the modern city. Moreover, the area in contemporary Rome where the monuments originally stood has changed beyond recognition. For one thing, the modern buildings sit 7 to 8 meters above the ancient Augustan level, which is entirely hidden from view, and whatever survives of it is buried underground. So only a computer simulation of the kind we created allowed us to make visual observations about their original appearance and alignment. The motivation to study the question and to make the simulation was our desire to test the validity of a previous influential visualization proposed by the German historian Edmund Buchner. As you can see on the slide, Buchner's visualization is a traditional pen and ink drawing. It illustrates his idea that the emperor wanted the shadow of the obelisk to penetrate into the center of the Ara Pacis, the altar of Augustan peace, on the emperor's birthday, September 23rd. This visualization should make the theory clearer. Those red arrows indicate the movement of the obelisk shadow as it goes from west to east into the altar during the afternoon of September 23rd, or at least that's what the theory purports to have happened. It turned out, however, that once we had resurveyed the monuments, performed a new coring through the pavement discovered by Buchner in 1980, and thoroughly examined his documents in the German Archaeological Institute in Munich, we were able to show in this article that Buchner's visualization was a clear example of the error that can arise from illustrating a priori, that is to say, pre-existing knowledge or pre-existing false knowledge, incorrect knowledge, as Humphreys discussed. Buchner had the idea that the shadow went into the altar on the emperor's birthday even before he had conducted his excavation that found a small part of the monument that I just showed you in the previous slide. When he dug and found something real, it contradicted his original theory. So he adjusted the theory by hypothesizing two phases of the monument, and what he found was in the wrong place by just a relatively small amount. It was positioned 1.5 meters higher than Buchner had expected, and also 4 meters farther to the west and 3 to the south. But in terms of Buchner's original theory, these slight differences put everything into just the wrong place for the shadow of the obelisk to have penetrated into the center of the Ara Pacis on September 23rd, Augustus's birthday. We created this computer simulation, which you see in this slide, that gives us the altar and the shadow of the obelisk on the emperor's birthday. You can see we've set the dials to September 23rd of 9 BCE, and we are able to advance the time of the day minute by minute to see what happens at the crucial moment when the shadow is supposed to go inside the altar, and we can see that it gets very close but veers off to the right and doesn't go inside. So, as we say in English, close but no cigar. But the computer simulation did more than just allow us to criticize Buchner's theory. It wasn't a pen and ink drawing, but rather an interactive digital creation. That allowed us to have the appearance of moving around in it, changing the time of day, the day of the year, even the year, over a 40-year period from 9 BCE to 40 CE, and using the simulation, making virtual observations for more than 1 year, and exemplifying Rudolf Arnheim's basic idea that perception gives rise to cognition, gives rise to thoughts, we were able to have some new thoughts because nobody had ever been able to do this before antiquity, of course. Nobody in modern times had ever been able to do this. Nobody had a simulation like this before. And what we found was that, yeah, the shadow did go into the center of the altar, actually on 48 days of the year, but one of those days was not the emperor's birthday. But as we did the field work, some other cognitions, other thoughts came into our mind. For example, we saw that at certain points on the axial line uniting the altar and the obelisk, actually on almost 240 days of the year, you saw this, an alignment of the altar with the obelisk and the solar disk, the sun. And this is a very, very striking relationship, visual relationship and visual effect, I think you will agree. We also found that if you had the obelisk to your back and looked at sunrise toward the altar, that on over 100 days of the year you saw this, the sun seemingly rise out of the altar. So putting this all together, we published a new interpretation of this relationship, claiming that it all had to do not with the shadow cast by the obelisk, but by the sun itself, seen either at sunrise to the east of the altar, rising seemingly out of the altar, or to the west, seemingly on top of the obelisk. And this was not surprising at all, because the inscription that the emperor had inscribed on the base of the obelisk in Rome survives in 2 copies on 2 sides, and it dedicates the obelisk to the sun god, Soli, the sun god. So it's really a monument about the sun, not about the shadow, not about the emperor and his birthday. It's celebrating the sun god. Well, of course, our article is over 100 pages, and our interpretation is much more complicated than I have been able to explain to you today, but I hope that it has whetted your appetite to read the article and to see all of the details and the ramifications that we work out. And I certainly hope to have shown you a very good example of Arnheim's idea that new perceptions may well give rise from time to time to new cognitions, new ideas, and Colin Ware's idea that a visualization can reveal emergent properties, features that we didn't expect to find when we started the research. I was interested in the shadow. I wasn't interested in the solar disk, but through the visualization, the interactive visualization, I got very interested in the solar disk, and it gave rise to some very fruitful ideas, I think. Okay, well, in our next case study, we'll again employ the methodologies of archaeoastronomy. We were looking at the sun in the first case study, so that's an archaeoastronomical question by definition. And in the second study, we will also employ an archaeoastronomical methodology. And what we'll be addressing is the god to whom the Pantheon, this most famous Roman temple, the best preserved temple of all in the city of Rome, to what god it was dedicated. We don't know the answer to that question. That is a question scholars have long debated. Can archaeoastronomy and an interactive visualization help us to come up with a new answer to that question, as we have, again, new perceptions, as we're able to run experiments and re-experience what it was like to be in the Pantheon on religious holidays. Well, let me give you a little background about the Pantheon. Originally built in the 20s CE during the reign of Rome's first emperor, Augustus, the building was destroyed, and then it was rebuilt at the end of the 1st century CE by the Emperor Domitian. Well, his building itself burnt down very quickly, and the Pantheon had to be rebuilt by an emperor in the early 2nd century CE named Trajan, and he died before he completed the project, so it was completed by his successor, Hadrian. And it's the Hadrianic Pantheon that we see in this photograph on the slide and that you see when you go to Rome today. Now, we refer to this temple as the Pantheon, but we know from the ancient sources that call it that they were calling it that as a kind of nickname. It wasn't its official name. It was the name just given to it in lieu of that official name, which unfortunately is never given to us in the sources, the very few ancient sources that mention it. Now, since the ancient historian Cassius Dio tells us that the two cult statues present in the building depicted Mars and Venus, several scholars in recent decades have inferred that the temple must have been dedicated to one or both of them. And usually these scholars have concluded that it was the temple of Mars, and Venus is just there as Mars's consort. And it wouldn't be surprising if the Pantheon had been dedicated to Mars, because it's located right in the heart of a part of Rome known as the Campus Martius, the field of Mars, Rome's war god. Moreover, the temple's pediment, which, as you can see today, has lost all of its decorative sculpture, in antiquity probably featured Mars flying down from the heavens to impregnate the Vestal Virgin Rhea Silvia, who's lying splayed out on the ground of the pediment, and thereby engendering two very important twins, very important in Roman history, Romulus and Remus, and they are shown to the left of their mother, Rhea Silvia, being suckled by the wolf. And this is a very famous, iconic moment in Roman legend and in Roman art. We call it the Lupa Romana theme, the Roman wolf theme in art. And what you've been looking at in this slide is the recent restoration made by Flyover Zone in collaboration with the archaeologist Brian Rose of the University of Pennsylvania. We tentatively accepted the identification of the temple as sacred to Mars, and for that reason we added a colossal statue group of Mars and Venus in the apse of the Pantheon. And the apse is this semicircular recess opposite the entrance at the end of the north-south axis of the building. Now, it should be noted that not everyone has accepted the identification of the Pantheon as the Temple of Mars. So we would like stronger evidence in favor of the hypothesis than the mention by Cassius Dio that the cult statues were of Mars and Venus. And even if we do accept that this was a temple of Mars, we need to know which cult of Mars. Rome at this period, in the time of Augustus through Hadrian, had 4 different temples of Mars, each with its own festival day and its own rituals. So yes, they're all related to the god Mars, but they relate to the god in different ways, to different guises and aspects of the god Mars. And we need to know which aspect was important in this particular building. So we can't just say it's a temple of Mars. That's not good enough. Well, as it happens, of the 4 temples of Mars in Rome in our period, we can securely identify the locations of 2 of them, and we also know the festival dates. Then there's a 3rd, which can be located with high probability. And that leaves a 4th. And it was the cult of Mars Invictus, the invincible Mars. That one is freely floating around the city. We've never been able to pin down its location. And the thesis that we were working with was that the Pantheon perhaps might be this missing temple of Mars Invictus. Well, one thing we know about the temple of Mars Invictus is that its festival date was May 14th. On the Julian calendar. And we know that from this official state calendar, which you see in a transcription of in this slide. And you see that underlined in red are the words Marti Invicto, that would be in Latin. So this 14th of May is holy to Mars Invictus, is what this is telling us. We know there was this holiday, but we don't know where the temple was located. Well, could the same empirical archaeoastronomical approach used to study the meridian of Augustus also help us to sort out the identification of the Pantheon? In that study of the meridian of Augustus, our technology team at Ball State's Idea Lab used the game engine Unity, enhanced with historic solar data scraped from NASA's Horizon system, database to create the tool that I was using to make my empirical observations. And it took the Idea Lab hundreds of hours of programming just to make it possible to support that research on the sun during the short period of time for this one spot on Earth. Well, just as my work on this Meridian of Augustus project was wrapping up, another tool became available when the open access planetarium software called Stellarium was enhanced with a plugin called 3D Sceneries. And this allows us to import a georeferenced terrestrial model anywhere on Earth into the planetarium, so our observations simulate what was seen in the sky on the site at some point in the past. And we can go back as many as 10,000 years from the present day, and we can set the sky to change on a minute-by-minute basis with high accuracy. So the advantage of using Stellarium over Unity is that Stellarium comes with built-in alt-azimuthal data for 1.5 million astronomical features, including the sun, the planets, the moon, the constellations, and over 1 million stars. That's actually overkill. The human eye, without light pollution in a really dark environment, can see about 5,000 or 6,000 stars, but no more. But anyway, Stellarium gives you a lot more at no cost, so we won't complain. Whereas the Unity app created by the Idea Lab was the work of brilliant programming, its use was very limited compared to what could be done out of the box and at no cost with Stellarium. So in the next case study, I imported the Rome Reborn model of the Pantheon. By the way, I was just doing this case study this year, so it's very fresh research, not yet published. I imported our model into Stellarium using 3D Sceneries to see if archaeoastronomy could shed any light on the dedication of the Pantheon. And to test the accuracy of our model of the Pantheon as imported into Stellarium was the very first important step in our project. We wanted to make sure that our model was correct. It was located correctly and it was giving correct and reliable results. So what did we do? We coded the coffers of the dome of the Pantheon using the system that you see here. Each column has a number varying from 1 to 28, and each row a letter varying from A to G. And then we had a research assistant go to the Pantheon 6 different times earlier this year and photograph where that solar beam coming through the oculus, or the hole in the middle of the dome of the Pantheon, hit the coffers. And we then simulated the exact same moment in time and same date in Stellarium using our Pantheon model. And lo and behold, as you can see in this one example in the slide, the results were exactly the same. So we can infer from that that if our model in Stellarium is rendering very accurate results for the year 2025, there's no reason why the results that we get for the year 126 CE during the reign of the Emperor Hadrian should not also be correct. Now, before I started to make my virtual observations, I wanted to be clear what I was looking for and where I should look for it. We know from the Roman architectural writer Vitruvius that temples were often oriented in such a way that worshippers on the festival day, who were gathered at the altar in front of the temple, outside of the temple, could look inside and see the cult statue. Because on the festival day, exceptionally in Roman religion, the doors of a temple were kept open. Normally the doors were shut closed, and you could not go inside a temple except on the festival day. So this suggested that what we wanted to do was stand outside of the Pantheon and look inside and see if there was any solar effect of that light beam coming down through the oculus in the dome and hitting the floor on a certain day of the year that made a spectacular effect, similar to the effect of, say, that solar disk on top of the Montecitorio Obelisk that I showed you in our first case study. So that meant that we wanted to stand here, outside the temple, with the doors open, looking toward the cult statue. And what we found was, lo and behold, this beam of light was visible without any distortion for the first time in the year at noon on May 14th. Well, May 14th, as you will recall, here we are looking at the same effect inside the Pantheon. So we have the oculus up above, the hole in the dome that allowed light to get into the building. Otherwise, there was no way to light the building. And we can see that the rays came through the oculus, and then, in this case, at this time of day and on this date, hit the floor just inside the doorway. Now, we were able to use stellarium to simulate the entire year and see how that beam of light was moving around. And in this little video, you'll just see examples for June 23rd, 2025. So this is, if you could be in Rome today when I'm giving the lecture, and if it's a clear day and you get that beam of light through the oculus, and you could stay there from noon till 6 p.m., here's what you would see. I'm showing you how the beam is changing every 30 minutes. As I say, we can do it on a minute-by-minute basis, but in the interest of time, I'm showing you every 30 minutes. This is how the beam of light moves around. So the beam of light is not always at the entry, as we saw on May 14th. In fact, it's only there on May 14th, so it's a very special effect. And most of the time, the beam of light is moving around on the coffering or on the walls of the Pantheon. And of course, that's irrelevant if you're standing outside the building at a religious festival on the outside looking in. The only thing you'll be able to see is the beam of light hitting the floor. And so this is what it would have looked like on May 14th in 126 CE. As you were standing out there, you would have seen the priests approaching the cult statue of Venus and Mars in the apse, opposite the doorway. And as you were standing outside the doorway at the altar, you would see that beam of light as a kind of welcoming mat, showing you the way inside. And I think this would have been a very stunning visual effect. So we can say that our second case study adds weight to the identification of the Pantheon as a temple of Mars, and not just any cult of Mars, but specifically the cult of Mars Invictus, which was celebrated, we know, on May 14th. Now, I don't want to give you the impression that our 3D models are only useful for archaeoastronomical studies. They are also useful for addressing completely unrelated research issues. In my last two case studies, I will give you examples of what we can now do. My third case study focuses not on a single monument like the Meridian or the Pantheon, but operates at the medium scale of the city center, specifically the Roman Forum, which you are seeing in this slide. Now, we have very few ancient literary sources that recount for us someone's visit to Rome. And the only visit by an emperor was that of Constantius II in the year 357 CE. That was Constantius's first time in his life to ever come to the old capital in Rome. And we are very fortunate that the historian active in that period, Ammianus Marcellinus, wrote up an account of the visit. And Ammianus tells us something quite interesting, namely that when he got to Rome, he was greeted at the gates of the city by some of the leading senators of the day, who took him straight away to the Roman Forum. And in the Forum, the tour started up on the Rostra, the speaker's platform. To quote Ammianus, "So then the emperor entered Rome, and when he had come to the Rostra, the most renowned forum of ancient power, he stood amazed, and on every side on which his eyes rested, he was dazzled by the crowding together of marvelous sights." So why did the emperor start his tour at the Rostra? The rostra, as I mentioned, was a speaker's platform. Did he come to give a speech? No. In fact, the rostra was used as a speaker's platform during the long phase of Roman history that we call the Republic, when elections were held and when assemblies of the people met in places like the Roman Forum to pass laws. And before the laws were passed, speakers would get up on this platform and address the throng either for or against the proposed law. Well, that hadn't happened in centuries because you remember the first emperor of Rome was Augustus. We've already mentioned him. And Augustus brought in a new form of government to ancient Rome, a form that we call the imperial system centered on an emperor. The word imperial is an adjective deriving from the word emperor. Why did the rostra even survive many centuries after the fall of the Roman Republic, when Rome was no longer a democracy and all the laws were decreed by the emperor who embodied the law? Well, that was the question that Constantius's visit raised in our minds as we considered the passage in Ammianus Marcellinus. Clearly, I think we can all agree that the implication of what Ammianus wrote is that the senators brought the emperor to the rostra because he could get a good view of the forum from this vantage point about 3.5 meters above the pavement of the forum plaza. Well, Ammianus continues his description of Constantius's visit to Rome for many more pages, telling us how he visited the Forum of Trajan, where a great equestrian statue of Trajan impressed him quite a bit. He visited the Pantheon, and he visited the other sites that many of which we still visit when we go to Rome today. But never again does Ammianus tell us where the emperor stood to see something. This happens only in the case of the rostra in the Roman Forum. Well, why did I even come upon this passage? I came upon it after working with Flyover Zone's technicians to create a virtual tour of the Roman Forum. Typically, when we make a tour, we put the virtual camera at the best vantage point to show you the feature or the monument that we want to present to you at a stop on the tour. And usually, as you can imagine, the best vantage point would be frontal and axial. That is, right in front of the monument and on the main axis. So at the center of the symmetrical center of the monument. That would be the ideal vantage point. But as we were going around the forum and trying to generate our views for the virtual tour, we found that it was almost impossible to provide a frontal and axial view of the monuments. The view straight ahead, where you were back far enough from the monument to take it all in at one glance, that view was blocked by another monument. So very often we had to do something that we don't ideally like to do, which is to put the virtual tourist up in the air on a platform, perhaps 5, 10, even 15 meters high off the ground. The most extreme case of this was the Temple of Antoninus and Faustina in the Roman Forum. Here you are looking at the frontal and axial view of the facade of the temple that you get when you stand in front of it. And notice that the view is very foreshortened. We're too close to the facade to really see it properly. And we know it was topped with sculpture, and we can barely see what the sculpture was from this vantage point. Why did the Romans decorate it with sculpture if they didn't want the sculpture to be seen? Well, right behind me is another building, the so-called Regia, a very important building in Roman religion. And I am now back up against the Regia as I'm trying to take in the facade of the Temple of Antoninus and Faustina. And it just doesn't work because the Regia is too close. The only resort that we have if we want to stay on the ground is to view the facade of the Temple of Antoninus and Faustina on the oblique, from a distance away at an angle. This is not the ideal vantage point that we know the Romans themselves were looking to have, and we know that from, for example, the way they illustrated monuments like this temple on their coins, and that illustration was always frontal and axial. So in the tour, what did we do? We resorted to putting the virtual tourist up in the air, and you can see that we had to go as high as 20 meters off the street and be over the Regia. Right in front of us, you see those two cypress trees sticking up. That's from the courtyard of the Regia. So we're over the Regia, 20 meters up in the air, and from here we get an ideal view of the Temple of Antoninus and Faustina. Well, another case in point is the Temple of Concordia at the other end of the Roman Forum. And I mentioned that the Temple of Antoninus Faustina was illustrated on a coin that shows it axial and frontal, and that's certainly true of the Temple of Concordia, as you can see. And you can see that, as was the case with the Temple of Antoninus and Faustina, the Temple of Concordia also was decorated with a lot of sculpture that obviously was meant to be seen. The Romans went to quite a great expense to put that sculpture up there, and they must have wanted it to be seen and appreciated by visitors to the Forum. But what did you see if you got as far away back from the facade of this temple as the monuments in front of it permitted? This is what you saw. Again, a very sharp angle, a very foreshortened view of the facade, and you can barely make out those statues on the gable of the roof. And why was that? It's because this time what's behind us is a triumphal arch, the arch of the Emperor Septimius Severus, built at the beginning of the 3rd century CE. Well, there is a solution, at least in the case of this particular temple, and that solution, as you can see in this little video clip, was provided by the rostra. We have flown to the top of the rostra, and now from an oblique angle, but only a slightly oblique angle compared to what we had to get over at Antoninus and Faustina, we can get a good view of the facade and the statues on top of the roof. Why can't we get far enough back from the temple when we're standing axially in front of it? It's because of the presence of the Arch of Septimius Severus, as I mentioned, and you can see it in this slide. And you can just see a corner of the facade of the Temple of Concordia behind the arch. But when we're on the rostra, we can get a pretty decent view of the whole facade, including the statues. So to conclude, here we have another case of where cognition arises from visualization, from seeing something. We tried to see the monuments of the Roman Forum to prepare our virtual tour, and again we were frustrated because the best way to view the monuments was not very natural. We had to go up into the air, or at least on one side of the Forum, we could go up onto the rostra. And that, we thought, might explain the fact that for centuries after the rostra had ceased to have its original function of providing an elevated platform where speakers could speak at legislative assemblies to the people of Rome, the rostra was nevertheless preserved and became a very, very important stop on the average out-of-town visitor's tour of the monuments of Rome, and certainly became a very efficient way to see the monuments packed into the Roman Forum, as we know happened with Constantius II. Now let us turn to our 4th case study. And now the scale is the biggest of all. In fact, we are going to operate at the scale of the entire city. And we are going to consider the spatial organization of ancient Rome. Here's where a city model such as Rome Reborn really comes into its own, and by letting us fly all around the city like a bird, it gets our brain's visualization cognition circuits firing in new and, I hope, fruitful ways. And before I sketch out some of the observations I have to offer you, let me note that in the scholarship, there are 2 diametrically opposed views about the spatial organization of ancient Rome. The common view is that Rome grew haphazardly over the centuries, and unlike the hundreds of colonies that it planted around the empire, it did not have a geometric city plan, and certainly did not have a decumanus and a cardo, that is to say an east-west and north-south main street, crossing at the middle of an orthogonal grid-like street system. And in this slide, you see the orthogonal grid system of the Roman colony of Cosa, about 90 miles north of Rome on the Tyrrhenian seacoast. As Ferdinando Castagnoli, a very distinguished Roman topographer of the previous generation, put it in his authoritative book on the topography and urbanistics of ancient Rome, regarding the regularity of urban structure, which is characteristic of the Roman and Greek world, it is completely absent from Rome. Now, the second view that I mentioned about the organization or lack of organization of ancient Rome is implicitly, I think, a reaction to the first view that I have just described, that things grew up rather haphazardly. And I think that this second view reflects an offended sense of civic pride by Roman scholars who were born in Rome and lived in Rome and taught at the great university in Rome, the Sapienza University. And I refer to the idea first proposed by the greatest professor of Roman topography of the early 20th century at the Sapienza, Rudolfo Lanciani, who believed that there was a hidden geometry dictating the layout of ancient Rome. According to Lanciani, it determined the alignment of some of the city's most important monuments. And on the screen, you see the hidden pattern that Lanciani believed he had uncovered. It's based on a geometrical form with a single central node, or in its later version by Piero Maria Lulli, who was active in the middle of the 20th century and taught urbanistics at the Sapienza. It was characterized by multiple nodes from which radiated lines of alignment tying together some of the city's major built features. The weakness in this theory of a hidden geometry of alignments, apart from everything else, is that it is based on a passage in the Roman writer Pliny, which says nothing about geometric or secret alignments, but rather is intended to bring out Rome's great size in comparison with other cities that Pliny describes elsewhere in his book. Well, once we have the city model and can fly around it as much as we like and go wherever we like, we start to see not a hidden geometry and certainly not an orthogonal layout that everybody else has missed. Instead, we see something else, the need to shift the terms of order from geometric to organic form. And the lack of geometry is actually not at all surprising. The urban planning literature for the whole world, not just for Rome, tells us that the orthogonal grid plan tends to arise in two situations: when a city like a Greek or Roman colony is founded at a specific time and there is need for an equitable distribution of lots among the colonists, or when a city needs to facilitate the flow of traffic. Neither condition applied to ancient Rome. Well, this means that we can just stop the search for the geometric form of Rome and stop lamenting its lack or trying to find an implicit hidden geometric order beneath the surface confusion. Instead, we can pay attention to what our visualization is really suggesting the more we look at it and explore the city, especially, as I said, from the air. That the Roman use of space conformed in a very organic way to the realities of the topography, economy, and environment. At least as I explored the city model, what started to emerge as the ordering principle was a clustering by topographical categories such as hilltop, hillside, valley floor, and river and riverbank. And then there was also a related clustering by building types, such as public bath, recreational facility, temple, private house, apartment tenement, and warehouse. Here are some examples of what I mean, and needless to say, the vast scope of the subject requires that I be very selective in the time remaining to us today. Well, the hilltops, or the upper reaches of the hillsides, were the favored location of elite houses, as we know is the case with the so-called Roman house on top of the Celian Hill, or the house where Trajan lived on top of the Aventine before he became emperor. And speaking of emperors, of course, the extreme case of a residence, an elite residence on a hilltop, is provided by the imperial palaces on the Palatine Hill, which you've been seeing in this slide. The hilltops tended also to be occupied by temples, which we see on all the 7 hills. Whether we think of the great temple of Jupiter Optimus Maximus on the Capitoline, the temple of the divine Claudius, the Claudianum so-called, on the Celian Hill, just opposite the Colosseum, or the temples of Diana and Minerva on the Aventine, and the temple of Serapis on the Quirinal, we find a lot of temples, especially the biggest temples, sited on the hilltops of the city. Of course, many of Rome's 80-odd known temples were situated on sites other than hilltops, the Pantheon, for example, which we've already considered. But here, too, an organic clustering can be observed. For example, many temples on the valley floors lined the long triumphal parade route through the city's valleys. So much for the hilltops. Between the 7 hills were the valleys, and here were constructed several thousand apartment buildings, which were largely situated on the lower slopes of the hills and on the adjacent valley floors. As an example, you are looking at the neighborhood known as the Suburra, which is just north of the Colosseum, as you can see in this slide. And it was on the valley floors that we find the Romans built their public facilities and public buildings. For example, the Circus Maximus, the great racetrack that could seat over 250,000 people, was on the valley floor between the Aventine and the Palatine. Or the Colosseum, which was on the valley floor between the Esquiline Hill and the Celian Hill. Not to be forgotten are the non-recreational public facilities, starting with the Roman Forum, which you are now seeing from the air. It was set on low-lying land near the Tiber River between the Capitoline and the Palatine Hills. And when it became too built up, Julius Caesar started the project of adding the so-called imperial forums just adjacent to the old Roman Forum, again on the flat land of the valley floors. Near the forums in the city center was the theater district. This is where a series of impressive theaters and other entertainment complexes were built on the flat land between the Tiber River and the Capitoline Hill. We can mention, in chronological order, the Theater of Pompey with its impressive garden, the Theater of Marcellus along the river, and the Theater of Balbus. We can also include here other entertainment complexes such as the Odeon, which is a smaller form of the theater of the Emperor Domitian, and his stadium nearby. The northern campus, Martius, which, as you can see in this video, was developed as the zone for imperial funerary temples and other funerary-related monuments, such as the funerary temple of the Emperor Hadrian, the funerary temple of his mother-in-law Matidia, the Ustrinum, or the place of cremation of the Emperor Antoninus Pius and his commemorative column, and just across the river, a similar funerary complex, the Mausoleum of Hadrian, that was used by emperors after the original imperial mausoleum, the Mausoleum of Augustus, which we are about to see, was filled up. Now, I've just mentioned the Tiber River, We had to go across the Tiber to get to the last mausoleum that was built, that of Hadrian. Let's talk about how the river and the riverbanks were used. Well, in this video, you see Flyover Zone's recreation of the port of Rome. That was about 13 kilometers downstream from the city of Rome, where the Tiber debouched into the Tyrrhenian Sea, near the modern-day airport of Fiumicino, for those of you who've been fortunate enough to travel to modern Rome. And this artificial harbor was built by the Emperor Trajan. And you can see that large cargo ships came into the port, they docked there, and their cargo was offloaded first and put into these warehouses, these big buildings that you're seeing around the harbor. And then the cargo was loaded onto small riverboats, and you can see some of the small riverboats starting to make their way upstream to the city of Rome. And when they got to the city of Rome, and you can see the little riverboats again on the Tiber River now, but now we're in the area of Rome itself, they offloaded their cargo, which was stored in big warehouses on the banks of the Tiber. And the biggest warehouse of them all we call the Navalia, which means ship's sheds. This was an enormous 200-meter long building that originally was built to house the ships of the Roman fleet. But when the fleet was moved south to the Bay of Naples area, the building was repurposed as a warehouse. And a very, very big warehouse it was indeed. Now upstream from the warehouse district along the river was the Tiber Island, which we see in this slide. It was modified, as you can see, to resemble an enormous ship. And note, too, that the island was used to house Rome's major healing cult, which was a temple dedicated to the god Aesculapius. Isolating the sick on the Tiber Island, quarantining them, we might say, was the obvious thing to do to protect the rest of the population from the contagion of whatever diseases they were suffering from. And it's such an obvious thing to do that in the Middle Ages and even down to the present day, there is still a hospital on the Tiber Island. And finally, we can mention the public baths. These were not clustered in a specific part of the city like those imperial forums and the Roman Forum that we saw, or the theaters and the entertainment district, the theater district, but as befitted their use as places where the public could come, first of all, for hygiene, to clean themselves, but also for recreational purposes. They were spread around the most populated neighborhoods of the city. You are looking at the baths of Diocletian in this slide. If you look closely, you can see a second reason for this location. The fact that the baths belched out a great amount of smoke coming from the furnaces that heated the water in the walls of the hot rooms of the baths. In this slide, you can see two more large public baths, the baths of Trajan in the middle ground and the baths of Caracalla on the horizon. It's probably not accidental that these three very large baths of Caracalla, Trajan, and Diocletian were situated on the east side of Rome, where the prevailing westerly winds could have helped blow the pollution out into the countryside and not back into those neighborhoods where people lived. So in conclusion, we're not forced to choose between seeing a hidden esoteric geometry or a puzzling or even lamentable lack of geometry when we consider the organization of space in ancient Rome. If we break free of the geometric obsession of a certain tradition of urban planning, traceable ultimately to Hippodamus of Miletus in the 5th century BCE, and instead if we invoke the thought of Camillo Zitte, a leading modern urban historian active in Austria in the late 19th century, then new terms for order suggest themselves for appreciating how the urban form of Rome was organic, functional, and let us not forget to add, beguilingly charming in a way that a geometrically laid out city rarely is. To give our interpretation of Rome's urban form greater depth and to connect it to the thought of modern urban planners and historians, Let me conclude by pointing out that our entire approach to analyzing the Roman cityscape is compatible with Zitte's influential views on urban design as expressed in his classic book, City Planning According to Artistic Principles. Zitte was disdainful of the orthogonal grid plan, which at one point he even called idiotic, and at another he called devoid of excitement. Visual stimulation is what Zitte sought in a city, and here too, like us, he privileges the average person's experience of the city, especially through the sense of vision, as opposed to the abstract geometry imposed by a draftsman designer, which appeals only to the intellect of an elite, if indeed it appeals to anyone. The only way a city can have character, Zitte thought, was by avoiding the dull repetition caused by the grid and encouraging variety that comes from adapting the urban form to the topography, lifestyle, and building traditions. At a certain point, he gives his manifesto for how modern urban planners should think about going about their task. Assuming that in any new development the cityscape must be made as splendid and pictorial as possible, Zitte wrote, in order to glorify the locality. Such a purpose cannot be accomplished with the ruler or with our geometrically straight street lines. Sundry curves, twisted streets, and irregularities have to be included artificially in the plan. An affected artlessness, a purposeful lack of intention. In linking my organic approach to Rome's urban form to Zitte and the important modern tradition of urban planning that he inspired, I do not wish to suggest that I simply applied Zittian ideas to ancient Rome, a city, by the way, not specifically discussed by Zitte in that book. To the contrary, the ideas that I presented in this talk grew over the years from my continual engagement with the interactive 3D reconstruction of ancient Rome. It was only in writing up my thoughts and in doing my scholarly homework for eventually publishing my work that I came across Zitte and recognized his relevance. So for me, Zitte serves not so much as a source of inspiration as a source of confirmation that in presenting my views to you today, I may be on the right track. But be that as it may, I hope that you will at the very least agree that my views, however correct or mistaken you may consider them, would never have arisen had I not been able to fly many times over the ancient city, trying to grasp the significance of what I was seeing. And I hope that as I now play this video again for the second time in my talk, that ancient Rome has become more comprehensible and more charming and fascinating to you too. Rudolf Arnheim would not have been at all surprised that my new visual sensations have resulted in some new thoughts. And in the end, that is my main point in this talk, that 3D urban models such as Rome Reborn can open up new vistas in the empirical, or better, sympirical study of ancient cityscapes. I hope my case studies have also shown that, as a visualization, Rome Reborn is not only a tool that teachers will, I hope, find helpful in presenting the city to their students, but also one that scholars will be able to deploy in several of the useful ways that Colin Ware showed are common to most scientific visualizations, including to those produced by the new field of virtual heritage. Thank you very much.